Assalamu alaikum everyone. Ramazan Kareem and Juma Mubaraka. My name is Jalal Khashib. I'm Senior Research Associate at CIGA, the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. Today is Friday, 8th of May, 15th of Ramadan. On behalf of CIGA, I would like to welcome you to our webinar series, a series of lecture organized by CIGA during Ramadan. And I have the honor to moderate today's lecture. Previously, we discussed different topics from economics to politics to ethics. And today is the day of geopolitics and the lovers of geopolitics. With the interesting topic on the geopolitics of the United States will be presented by Professor Dr. Sami Alarian. Dr. Sami Alarian is the director of CIGA and also is professor of public affairs at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University based here in Turkey. He received his PhD in 1986 in the United States, where he spent about 40 years of his life there, and he was a prominent scholar and also is famous advocate for human rights and Palestinian case, and he still. Also, he is the founder of many association, educational, research, and civil institutions. Moreover, Dr. Sami wrote different books, articles, and studies focusing especially on the U.S. foreign policy, the Palestinian case, the Arab Spring, and of course with special interest on the geopolitical field of research. His last book was published last year under the title of The United States and Israel, from Enabler to Strategic Partner. So we have a lot of things to learn from his expertise and knowledge. Please join me to welcome Professor Dr. Sami Alarian. Dr. Sami, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Jalal, for this generous and kind introduction, and thank you everybody for being with us. I would like to get straight to the topic because it's going to be a lengthy discussion, I hope, and interesting for many people. I would use a PowerPoint presentation as we go along, and with that, let me start with the first slide. Discussing geopolitics, of course, involves a lot of things. There are things that I'll be able to cover today, and there are things that I will not be able to cover because of the time is not enough for me to cover everything. A lot of people have been asking me yesterday when this came about. This was a broadcast that went viral that basically accused the U.S. of having a conspiracy after they passed their legislative the coronavirus supplemental bill, which amounted to about $2.2 trillion. And a lot of people, when they looked at the bill, they thought that this was a conspiracy because the bill itself was introduced back in January of 2019, HR, which is House of Representatives 748. And the implication is that the U.S. had already known about it and that the U.S. was pushing the coronavirus on the world for strategic and geopolitical reasons, and they are basically deceiving everybody. When this was pushed, obviously, there is a lack of knowledge of the U.S. political system, and I would answer this question shortly thereafter. So when we talk about strategic imperative of the U.S. and talking about geopolitical analysis, what I will try to cover in this presentation is how do we understand geopolitics, what are U.S. strategic objectives in the world since it's become a U.S. since its inception, as well as what is the US economic objectives. When we discuss geopolitics, we're talking about different factors. We talked about geography, power, politics, international relations. Geopolitics is the field that is concerned with how geographical factors, including territory, population, strategic location, natural resources, as modified or affected by economics and technology. When we talk about the US as of today, not necessarily as it started back in the 1776 era, during the Revolutionary War, or when it became a federal state after the Constitution of 1787 and the first election of its first president in 1789. The US today has about 330 million living in it. It was few million at the time. It's about 4% of the population in the world. In terms of territory today, the US was not the same as it is today. Today, it occupies approximately 57.3 million square miles. It's about 3.7 million square miles out of the Earth, which is 57 million. We're talking about approximately 6.6% of the Earth's surface. In kilometer, that would be about 9.8 million kilometers. Out of the Earth's surface, about 148.3 million kilometers. In terms of GDP, the US today is about 21 trillion, out of the world of about 81 trillion. We're talking about almost a quarter. But we also, when we talk about geopolitics, it talks about the relations, how it affects relations between states and the struggle for domination, whether that is in terms of the regional hegemony or world or global hegemony. So geopolitics, in short, is the interaction between geopolitical agents and structure. Geography, as you know, is an investigation of how politics and space are inseparable. That's the whole concept of geopolitics. And we'll talk about structure. We'll talk about the situation within a particular place that determines how global politics impact actions taken within countries and places. Now, when we do geopolitical analysis, we're basically saying that we are trying to employ a methodology in which we can understand the world and predict the behavior of states, especially great powers, such as the US today and other great powers. It's an application or activation of power within a particular geography. That means we have to take all these factors into consideration: geography, topography, natural resources, demography, which is the study of population, as well as history and culture, political order or structure, economy, the industrial base, technology, great power rivalry, whether you form alliances to cooperate or whether you assess the threats and try to defend, as well as national needs and expectations, what is called the national interest. All these together would have to be taken into consideration when a person is performing a geopolitical analysis. All these factors are important. Now, going back to this question that I posed at the beginning, and here we talk about, for example, the political structure. This conspiracy theory that has been going viral across the social media is a myth, because according to the Constitution of the US, when we talk about bills or legislation that involves money, it has to start from the House of Representatives. It cannot be taken up by the Senate. So this particular bill, 748, that everybody is touting as being the conspiracy because it was eventually passed with $2.2 trillion and was introduced last year, was a bill that was concerned with middle-class health or tax benefits. It passed the House of Representatives, which was controlled by the Democrats, and it went to the Senate, and the Senate sat on it because obviously the Senate didn't want to pass a Democratic bill, and it was ready or on their desk from last July. But when the coronavirus hit the US, and most people, most Congress people were actually not in Washington, D.C., and it was very difficult for them to come back together. I'm talking about the House here. The House was not in session, but the Senate was in session. So the leader of the Senate took that legislation, amended it, changed it, because he wasn't going to wait for another bill to come his way. And it was with the same number, but a completely different bill that addressed the coronavirus crisis. And then it was sent to the House. And of course, the House did not really reconvene. It just passed it because they used a loophole where only a few members were in the will of the House. It passed, and it then got signed by the president. The point of this exercise is to show you that political structures, constitutional matter, they do matter, these things. And we cannot just talk about conspiracies in these ideas. So what I will talk about as we go today is to talk about the political power of the United States. And political power is measured in military, economics, technology, industry, as well as culture. And that's what is called sometimes soft power. The dimensions of the geopolitical analysis that we will try to cover involves three things. First, the internal geopolitics of the geographic area under study, and in this particular case, we're talking about North America. Second, the interaction of that country or region with its immediate neighbors who share borders with it. And in this instance, we will talk, especially at the beginning, the relationship between the U.S. as it was formed in the early days of the Republic, and as it expanded also throughout its region, and how it became a regional hegemon before it became a global one. And finally, the interaction and influence that this particular piece of geography, this particular country, in this case in the US, exerted on it by other great powers, either in the world or in the region. Now, as I said, I will discuss two things here. I will discuss strategic imperatives and economic objectives, strategic objectives and economic objectives. And with that, I will discuss primarily 6 strategic objectives that the U.S., since its foundation, was working on. And this is not, I mean, these were not conceived by the founders of the Republic. They just came through naturally as the state was expanding from being a small power into a greater power, and then into a global hegemon. These were not perceived as being the start of an empire at the beginning. It came gradually through many years and many presidents, and I will discuss that a little bit more in details. As you see from the geography of the United States, from the map on the screen, you could see that the U.S. Had 2 neighbors, primary neighbors. To the north, you have Canada, and to the south, you have Mexico, and then you have 2 great oceans. So from that perspective alone, of course, the U.S. did not start that way, and I will discuss also that in a minute. What you have here is once it became that particular geography, that you have great oceans on either side, which limits the possibility of other invaders to come to the U.S. And that obviously is one of the greatest geopolitical situations that a country can find itself in, that it is going to be protected by these massive bodies of water. And of course, that is an advantage that not too many countries can claim. Unlike European countries, for example, where they have many countries as neighbors to each other, which makes it vulnerable to the powerful ones. Now, what I will discuss here, as I said, would be 6 strategic and security imperatives, as well as 2 economic ones, and that resulted in a political hegemony once these were realized, along with other cultural, social, and religious factors. What I will not be able to cover in this presentation are the points of weaknesses, vulnerabilities, what are the U.S. Is facing in terms of internal problems. All these things, they really need other kinds of lectures. Usually this kind of lecture I would give probably over 3 different lectures or presentations or hours. So I will only cover in this today the strategic and security imperatives that made the US what it is today geopolitically, as well as its economic imperatives that the US is pushing so that it stays as the economic power of the world. Now, when the US started, this is the first strategic imperative, and it's called Manifest Destiny. Now, the US started officially as a federal state when the Constitution passed. Obviously, it started in '76 with the Revolutionary War as a confederacy. It was very weak, and it faced all kinds of problems. Then the founding fathers got together, they established the Constitution, and then the Constitution was ratified by the 13 original states, and then they formed the federal state or the federal government. And then with the inauguration of its first president, Washington, in 1789, that's when officially the state started. They started basically on the eastern side, as you could see on this area. And then with this concept of manifest destiny, and manifest destiny basically is the concept that America has the right, that Americans have the right to control whatever land they want. They can just take whatever it is. And they call them, quote unquote, pioneers. So they went from east to west, just grabbing as much land, taking control of as much land as they could possibly take. And that involved many conflicts, particularly during the early years. Of course, that started from the get-go, from the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, that acquisition of land was done by settlers, pioneers. That's what they named themselves. And of course, strategically speaking, what the US wanted was to control the Mississippi Basin, because this is where most transport would take place. In order to have a governable state, you needed that the water first, and then also the transport that comes with it, of course, with the absence of the railways, which came at a later stage. But they kept going. They displaced millions of Native Americans, what is called Indians. It's a misnomer. They're not Indians. They're Native Americans, or natives, we should say, indigenous people of the land. And they went and they kept taking them west and holding them in reservations, which is, small territories where they hold them, like what we call today Bantustans, what used to be in South Africa, or what is going to take place today in the occupied territories in Palestine. These Bantustans where the Indians were held, were taken, but also there were other wars that took place. Much of the West was taken from Mexico. Mexico had control over this, or at least claimed control over it. So all these settlers would go there and they would settle there, and then there will be more wars, and then they will be victorious in those wars, and then they will form states, and then these states would join the US later. Or there was unclaimed, which is the top north here, Oregon. This was unclaimed, or at least not incorporated. This was basically under the control of the British, who also ceded control because it was far away, and to them it wasn't worth the fight. There were also other wars with Mexico and other Spanish wars. These took place over the course of almost half a century. So by the time we had the Civil War, the US pretty much took shape. But also I need to note that during the third presidency of Thomas Jefferson, where Napoleon was very much involved in his wars in Europe, he wanted money, and he wasn't able to fight the US, and the US basically gave him the ultimatum: either he would sell what is called the Louisiana Purchase. It's much more than the city of Louisiana. It's almost 1/4 of the US, as you see here. And he got it for $15 million. So about 1/4 of the US was bought. But also when you buy it, doesn't mean that you have the right to it, because as I said, indigenous people took nothing. This was bought by the US government from France, who claimed the possession of this territory. At any rate, that was also part of it. So to sum up, the first imperative is to lay control over this whole vast land of North America. They tried to push north, but they pushed as much as they could, and then they stopped because it was a weak neighbor, and it was much of it obviously was not inhabitable, and it was cold and all that. But there would be no real threat coming from the north. As far as the south, they took as much as they could, including obviously the state of Texas, which came through war with the Mexicans and then declared independent, and then it joined the states in the 19th century. So you could see by the middle of the 19th century, we had the U.S. Pretty much taking form, with the exception of the faraway, which is Hawaii and Alaska. These came later. Alaska was purchased from the Russians in the early 20th century for $5 million, which by itself is almost a quarter of the U.S. And Hawaii was colonized, and then it was in the 1898, and then it joined the Union almost 60 years later, in 1959. So by the middle of the century, pretty much the U.S. has taken its shape as we see it today, and that's the first major. That to be a regional hegemon, you have to be able to defend yourself. You have to be able to get enough territory so that you can get all the resources that are needed to become an empire, or to become a hegemon, as well as to be able to defend yourself. So from this end, the U.S. defeated the British from the north, defeated the Mexicans from the south, became much stronger than both, and they were able to have enough territory to establish a U.S. economic engine, as well as a political system that would be strong, even though there was a civil war. The civil war here was really over slavery, because the South, the states in the South, they did not want to free the slaves. They were more depending on plantations, while the North was more of an industrial base. They wanted labor. So a lot of it had to do with economics, also with other concerns, and that ended, obviously, as everybody knows, in favor of the freeing of the slaves of the North during the 16th president, Lincoln. So the second strategic imperative, after first securing the whole land, was to make sure that the South, or the Western Hemisphere, will not be controlled by any other power that could threaten the United States. And here, U.S. politicians, or U.S. strategic thinkers, were more concerned about European powers. So this came in during the fifth president, James Monroe, in 1823, when he declared the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically says that no particular or no great power, in this case, as I said, European power, will have or be allowed to have military presence or colonies in the Western Hemisphere. In other words, this is our backyard, this is our region, and we're not going to allow anybody to do it. Simply by declaring this doesn't mean that it happens, but that is the policy, and the U.S. from that moment on was keen on ending all military presence and all presence of great powers within that hemisphere. And that, of course, reminds us of what happened in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviets were able to slip through the nuclear missiles, nuclear weapons on Cuba, and how that became an extremely worrying situation for the U.S., aside from obviously being only 90 miles from Florida. At any rate, this is the second strategic imperative, which is to end the presence of all military bases or military presence of great powers, so that they will not be threatening the U.S. So here, the U.S., through that doctrine, through Manifest Destiny, was able to secure itself in terms of its territory, as well as from any threats coming from the north or the south. The third, now after the U.S. was able to secure itself, the third strategic imperative was now the US wanted to secure itself from both east and west, and that we're talking about oceans. So how is the US is going to do that? It's through building a navy. That started during the 20th and 21st presidents James Garfield, who was in office only for a few months because he was assassinated, and then he was succeeded by Chester Arthur in 1981. And then throughout the 1980s, the US embarked on a project to expand its navy and make it the largest in the world. Before the Civil War, the U.S. had small navy, but it was a few hundred ships. And after the Civil War, it had only about 50 or so, but it was pretty weak. It was about 12th in the world. But by the end of the 1980s, it was progressing so fast that it became a rival to the British Navy, the Royal Navy, which was the largest in the world at the time. So this was another way of obviously securing the US from both ends by building the largest navy that they could actually build in order to secure the US from any threats coming through the seas, for the high seas, through the oceans. The fourth strategic imperative came after the US went to the world stage in 1898. This was during the 25th President William McKinley, when they went and through the American-Spanish Wars and were able to acquire the different Spanish territories, including the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and other territories. And in which case, obviously, the U.S. now became a world player, not necessarily the largest, not necessarily the hegemon, but certainly a player. And the target was how we're going to project our power through controlling all the trade routes, because the U.S. had a different, they didn't want to go and occupy directly, even though they occupied the Philippines and other territories, but they wanted to open markets and they want to control the trade routes. So the fourth strategic imperative was how to control the trade routes around the world. And that also means that they have not only a powerful navy, but they must have the most dominant navy. And that's exactly the project that they went through. And that didn't take shape until about the middle of the century, then the 20th century, and through the Second World War, where the only true victor was really the US, because it was intact in terms of the war itself, with the exception of Pearl Harbor, never really touched the main land, while all other developed or all other great powers were basically devastated, whether it was the Soviet Union or whether it was Europe, Germany, France, UK, and so on and so forth. So the UK came through that with and of course throughout the war, they mobilized their industrial base. So the shape of the navy itself was taking shape in a way that it became very dominant. It was able to control the seas, and that process continued throughout the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, until today. So the fourth strategic imperative then is to control the trade routes, because this will consolidate the control of the US, not only over its ability to impose certain trade policies, but also to project power throughout the world, where other great countries will not think about not only threatening the US, they will be thinking about protecting their own. Now we're done with 4 strategic imperatives. Let me go to the 5th. Now, the 5th one was developed during the 33rd president, Harry Truman, in the aftermath of the Second World War. In this situation, the US has ascended to become the most powerful country in the world, to become the most dominant great power in the world, and the strategic thinkers were concerned about how to maintain that status. The only country that could have threatened the US, certainly, most European countries were devastated, and the US was able to achieve its objectives by forming alliances, but also by, as I said, in the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. was concerned about military bases, so they took advantage of the weakness, the relative weakness of the UK at the time. During the World War II, they instituted what's called the Lend-Lease, program, in which they agreed for Britain to basically end its military presence, especially the naval military presence, throughout the Atlantic Ocean, as well as other Latin American countries, in exchange for giving them loans and weapons and so on and so forth. Of course, Lend-Lease is much more than that, but that was part of it that is not much publicized. At any rate, so they were able to maintain that and continue the hegemon status in the Western Hemisphere, but they also went throughout the world, as I said, by controlling the different trade routes and oceans and so forth. And now with the emergence of the new threat of the Soviet Union, it wasn't just geopolitical, but also ideological. One of the theories of geopolitics is whoever controls this area, the Eurasian area, is the one who would control the whole world. In other words, this is an of extreme important territory, and since it was under the domination of the Soviet Union, they had to institute a policy. That policy is called containment, and as I said, it came through pretty clear during the 33rd President Harry Truman and those who came after him, and it was a very successful, actually, policy that stayed in place for about 45 years, about half century, until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. And the idea of the balance of power, or the idea of containment, is simply you cannot have a hot war, because the Soviet Union pretty soon was able to have nuclear weapons, and that would have threatened the US. Not only in its presence outside the US, but even in the US territory itself. So the idea of a hot war was never contemplated. But how we're going to deal with this threat is through containment, and that means that we have to form alliances, military alliances, political alliances, and all kinds of incentives to these countries, so that the Soviet Union will always be busy in trying to fend off all the different challenges in its own neighborhood. And that policy also was expanded, not just against a great power like the Soviet Union at the time, but also against any emerging power. That one way to, and I will give a few examples in a minute, whenever you are trying to deal with an emerging threat, a threat that could challenge the US hegemony, whether in the particular region or worldwide, the way to do this is to contain it by introducing or empowering other countries, other powers, so that they will start their rivalry or their competition with the targeted country, and through that, the target country will no longer think about threatening or challenging the US. They will try to protect themselves. So this is a very stable policy that the US follows with all emerging threats. It doesn't matter who that is, they will always do that, and they will always find ways by building up these small powers, or by at least arming them, or forming political alliances or military alliances. We could see that, of course, during the Iraq War, that they were arming both sides sometimes, and they were supporting Saddam to make sure that they can check the power of Iran, and if that tilted in terms of Saddam, they will try to withhold back support in order to continue and exhaust these two. Here is an example. I'm going to give you several examples for how this policy, this strategic imperative, is implemented. If you remember, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the formation of the Russian Federation, the NATO alliance was expanding eastward. Now, the Warsaw Pact meant that Poland was in the camp of the Soviet Union. This whole area of Eastern Europe was in the camp of the Soviet Union, and this was basically the line. Germany itself was divided into East and West. After its unification, the West kept going eastward, And then, of course, that happened during a time of uncertainty in in Russia during Yeltsin. And then when Putin came, basically the understanding was that, okay, we're going to agree with this. You took the Baltic states, you took Poland, you took Romania, you took Bulgaria and other places, but Ukraine is our red line. Belarus, of course, will never go west because it has a large Russian demography. And again, here's demography where it plays a role. But Ukraine was why? Why is Ukraine was the red line? Because if you could see the distance between Ukraine and Moscow is less than 600 miles. So if the West has its troops at the borders with Russia in Ukraine, that is only about 2 days battle where they can get Moscow, and they understand from their experience against the Germans in the Second World War II is that this is untenable position. They were almost defeated except for different factors, and there is no way they can go from Moscow because this area is not mountainous. In other words, this is pretty open. That leaves them only with the option of nuclear weapon, which is not an option that is acceptable. Therefore, when the West tried to push its luck and move through Ukraine during the early days of Obama, what happened is that, of course, the Russian pushed back and ended this. So that's what's pure geopolitics, has nothing to do with ideology or anything else. Any other state could have predicted, anybody could have predicted this, any state would have done the same. If they are going to protect themselves. I'm not advocating this, I'm only trying to explain. And by the way, whatever I'm saying here, I'm just trying to explain. I'm not criticizing, I am not advancing anything, I'm only trying to explain because it's very important before we take any position that we understand what's going on in the world using the correct analysis. Here is another example. This was, again, I mentioned earlier, the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1962. What people do not understand, they thought that what the Soviets were doing was barging on the U.S. territory by introducing nukes in Cuba back in '62. But this was actually a response when the U.S. during the Eisenhower era and then followed by the Kennedy administration, they placed actually nuclear weapons in Turkish territory, which is only a few hundred miles from the Soviet Union, which pretty much shortened the length by which a first strike could take place, which was untenable. And the way that this crisis was resolved is when the Americans agreed to withdraw their nuclear weapons from Turkey, and in exchange, the Soviets withdrew their nuclear weapons from Cuba. Here is another example of, again, containment. As you see here, what Obama spent his years doing was to strengthen the alliances, the political and military alliances with China's neighbor. Because when he said, I'm doing the pivot to the east, meaning that he wants to confront China because it's an emerging threat, an emerging strategic threat to the hegemony status of the US, what he was saying basically is that he wanted to strengthen the alliances and strengthen the neighbors of China, so China would not think about going outside and become a regional hegemon, because you cannot become a global hegemon if you're not a regional one. And what is happening is many people talk about the power of China. Indeed, China is powerful, especially when it comes to economic status. But when it comes to military one or the ability to control its region, it's far away from it. So we're talking about decades before China could claim its status as a regional hegemon, let alone to become a global hegemon. So a lot of this talk is really empty and hot air, because it does not, and unless of course the US itself loses its power. With the current status, it's very difficult to see. You could see here how strong the relationship between the US and Japan, South Korea, of course, Taiwan, which has a special status, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, all these are allies of the US, and the US is trying to strengthen them, prop them up, try to make them independent as much as possible from China. And of course, China, in turn, is trying to ameliorate this, and it's very difficult, obviously, but usually it's easier for neighbors to be in contention because of the historical tension that's taking place, and that's how great powers can exploit this. So this is a sort of containment. This is a sort of addressing a threat, an emerging threat, by creating other rivalries, by strengthening other rivalries for that particular power, to busy it with this rather than challenge the U.S. Power or hegemony. Here is another example where the presence of the U.S. Navy. This is the Strait of Malacca, which comes from Malaysia, and that's where 80% of the global trade by sea goes through. 90% of important oil to China, Japan, South Korea, while going through the South China Sea, they have to go through, and 64% of China's trade has to go through, while only 14% of U.S. trade. That's almost over 100,000 vessels every year. Now, this is certainly controlled by U.S. Navy, and they can stop it at any moment, which gives them great leverage in any negotiations or in any conflict, if it ever happens, over their rivals. So that shows how vulnerable some states are and how powerful others are. Now, here is another example. Again, this is Iran. This is the view from Tehran. If someone is sitting in Tehran, this is what they're seeing. They're seeing basically they are being surrounded by U.S. military bases and powerful fleets and aircraft carriers and others from everywhere. Every country almost in the region has some sort of a base. The Fifth Fleet of the U.S. is based in Bahrain. The largest Air Force base outside the U.S. is in Doha. The different military bases throughout the region, from Afghanistan to Saudi Arabia, to Oman, to the United Arab Emirates, even to Turkey and Iraq. It's everywhere. So that gives the idea of how the U.S. is able, if they want to threaten a particular state. So military does, or hard power plays a role. That's why Iran would have sometimes to calculate whether it is in their interest to have a direct confrontation with the U.S. Here is another example with Turkey. Again, this is about containment. Turkey, again, the idea of containment, or the idea of the fifth strategic imperative, is not to allow any regional power to extend its power beyond what is permitted, meaning that this is not going to threaten, not now or 10 years from now, maybe 50 years from now, the strategic interest of the United States. So Turkey, for the past 15 years, have been trying or charting a course by which they're trying to extend their power beyond their neighborhood and beyond their what the U.S. thinks is permissible to them, especially under this particular government. So what happens in the past few years, during Obama particularly, and is that if you look at Turkey's neighbors, what we see here are very weak neighbors: Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Syria with the civil war, Iraq with almost dysfunctional government, or to the west, Greece and Cyprus and others. These are pretty weak neighbors. So the U.S. cannot prop them up to challenge Turkey. So what do? They think of what is the most consequential and problematic challenge that Turkey could face, and that's basically the Kurdish situation. So they take advantage of what's happening in Syria, and they arm almost 50,000 Kurdish troops. Even these are troops that they know, many of them belong to an organization that the U.S. has designated as a terrorist organization. They know that most of these are people who have left-wing ideologies, yet it is in the interest of the U.S. to create this particular thorn in the side of Turkey, because that then will force the Turkish strategic thinkers and the Turkish government or successive governments to think about their own internal cohesion, harmonious. 20% of Turkey's population are Kurds, and therefore they need to maintain that cohesion, that unity, and therefore they will not think about going outside the borders. They will think about protecting them. And indeed, this policy is working. because Turkey now is more concerned about its southern border with Syria. It's more concerned about the presence of PKK and of the emerging situation of state, whether on the side of Iraq with the Kurdish region or on the side of Syria, where they have actually taken steps towards establishing either an autonomous state or an actual Kurdish state by which they could threaten the internal or the integral territory of Turkey. So this is again, these are several examples of the fifth strategic imperative. Now the sixth one and final one, again, as I said earlier, these strategic imperatives do not start and stop. They continuously happen. At all times they are going on. They have a starting point, but they continue to happen. And what I attempted to do here is to give you the starting point. Possessing high and critical technology is this sixth strategic imperative, and it started actually with the emergence of the US as an industrial state, and then of course they excelled at the world level. But it became more imperative after the space era, which came in the 1950s. First, the Soviets were able to send men to space, which gave a lot of concern and worry for the U.S. Policymakers and for the U.S. strategic thinkers that this could be an important phase. So back in '58, when they started NASA and others, and they spent hundreds of billions of dollars on the development, research and development in these critical areas and infrastructure. So it continued until it took a shape during the 40th president, Ronald Reagan, in which he announced at the time what he called SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. The idea here is to dominate space. Not only it's enough to dominate the oceans and the earth, but we have to dominate the space, and especially high technology. Today there is a whole war about what is called the 5G, which is who is going to control the infrastructure of the future communications, the Internet of Things, and all these robotics and automations and integrations, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. All these are important, very critical segments in which the U.S. wants not only to have domination over them, but also to deny it to others, or at least not have them able to compete in a way that they can weaken the U.S. So the space is very important. So there is a whole cyberspace also. There's a whole kind of budgets and spending that goes into this area, because if happens in the future that we do have a war, this war could actually end before the first fire is shot, by simply killing all the satellites, which are the eyes and ears of any war. And that means that we have to dominate space. So this is the strategic domination of space. So you have this whole U.S. ballistic missile defense system throughout. You have 800 military bases. I'm going to go quickly because of time. You have military presence overseas, over 800 military, hundreds, over 500 ships. These are the military commands of the U.S. that goes, the whole world is split into U.S. Northern Command, which is the home base, Southern Command, AFRICOM, the African Command, the European Command, which is NATO, the U.S. Central Command, which is basically the 22 countries in the Middle East, Egypt, and eastward, the Pacific Command, all that with different fleets. Each one is controlling a different sea. These are the countries where military bases exist in the U.S. military bases around the world. This is where Britain has some bases just in the Commonwealth area. These are just really not very. These are not very strong. This is basically a presence, because these are Commonwealth countries. This is French, again, the French, especially in Africa, the former French colonies. This is the Russian, and basically it's Russia and some of its allies. And this is China, simply in Djibouti. But here is, where Russian bases and where the U.S. bases. So this is the containment in action. This is where every region is having military bases to contain any emerging challenge. Just a couple of weeks ago, this is in the midst of the coronavirus, you could see the movement of the U.S. Fleets going around, especially encircling in the most strategic areas, whether this is in the Pacific and the South China Sea, or whether it's in the Mediterranean and Suez Canal and the Red Sea, and so on and so on, on Persian Gulf, and so on and so forth. So just a quick review here of the relative powers that we have, and I wanted to look particularly to the defense budget. You have a budget of last year budget 718 billion this year of the US. That's about 4 times the budget of China. Just look at Germany. People talk about Germany and Europe. Germany has only 179,000 troops. It cannot even defeat Turkey, as some of the strategic thinkers said. They cannot. They're mainly to protect themselves at best. So there is no rivalry really in Europe. Russia is still a small power. The power of Russia is its boldness, as well as its ability to, obviously, its nuclear weapons, but also its ability to project power in certain areas, but not much by that, and through arms sales. And China, of course, is an emerging threat. But look at how many aircraft carriers. For the US, they have 11, where you have 7 active, 3 on reserve at all times. China has 1. They're trying to build another one. I mean, that takes years and decades to happen. The US, to build their Navy, it took 100 years to reach that particular number, which is over hundreds of ships and so on, and 800 bases, where China has only 1 military base outside. Russia has 9. But of course, this is an important number. The research and development. The US spends about 511 billion last year. Of course, about 10 years ago, they were spending about 400 billion. If you look at China, they were spending 150. That tripled. The US didn't triple. They went, of course, 20% over a decade, still substantial. But that's where China is trying to invest by trying to accelerate their technology. And of course, there's a lot to be talked about here, but we don't have time to go through it. If you look at Russia and Germany, in extension, they are still very modest. All right. Now, let me very quickly summarize the grand strategic objectives and doctrines for the US. First, secure North America. We said that happened during Manifest Destiny, and that happened early in the Republic, when the early founders they started expanding west, and then the Monroe Doctrine came in 23. That's the 5th president, and that dominance over South America. Then the Navy supremacy, in order to able to defend the U.S. from both oceans, Pacific and Atlantic, that came in the 1880s during the 21st and beyond presidents. Navy supremacy over the Atlantic and the Pacific. Then after 1898, during the 25th president and beyond, the idea was to control and where the U.S. would become a major great power or world power by controlling or having the ability to control the oceans and trade routes. And then in the aftermath of the Second World War, during the 33rd president Truman, it was the idea of preventing any Eurasian state from becoming powerful or so powerful to challenge U.S. hegemony, or what is noted as the balance of power, by creating other powers. And finally, the monopoly over high-tech and complete dominance of space. Now, I want to turn to the last few minutes about, these are the strategic objectives in the Middle East. I don't have time to go through them, but these are the 7 objectives that people could see that they're trying to maintain. This is just on the regional basis. But now, the building of an empire and hegemonic power through military alliances, political alliances, economic, obviously, technology, and culture. I want to talk a little bit about the economy, because this whole thing is about maintaining U.S. economy, about maintaining the U.S. status as the world's richest and the world's most powerful economy. If you could see, this is the budget that last year, the U.S. is spending $4.4 trillion, and with the revenue of about $3 trillion, there's a deficit of $1 trillion a year. That's huge. How is the U.S. able to do that? You could see this the deficit. Well, first of all, if you look at the U.S. debt from the first president until the 40th president that came in during Reagan. In 1984, 1983, 84, first term of Reagan, that was $1 trillion. then it kept climbing. You know, if you go from President 1 to President 40 at 1 trillion, now we are President 45. What we have today is $22 trillion. And that $22 trillion obviously is money that is not covered by gold. So the US wanted to be dominant in terms of the economy. So what they did is that they initiated during the midst of World War II, while all countries are occupied with the war and they wanted the help desperately of the US to win the war. So the US basically said that we want to guarantee, they wanted the dollar to become the dominant. That's the first economic imperative, is to have the world as the reserve country, the dollar to be the reserve country, the reserve currency, sorry, of the world. So to do that, they established this Bretton Woods system in which they said, we are going to guarantee for anybody, a holder of dollars, that we can convert that to gold at a fixed rate. That system stayed intact for about 20 plus years. It ended in 71 when the 37th President Nixon stopped that practice, because how do empires end? Empires end by being bankrupt because of the wars, the amount of wars they go through. The US has been almost all its history, with the exception maybe of 2 decades, in a permanent state of war. In Afghanistan, this is the longest war. So what happened during Vietnam is that the US was printing money and spending so much, and the French, de Gaulle at the time, saying, what is that coming from? Of course, the French were profiting nicely from that because of their presence in their former colonies in the Southeast Asia. And then Nixon said, hell with you, we're not going to cover anything. But they still had to maintain the dollar to be the reserve currency of the world. If no longer they can convert it to gold because their gold reserves were dwindling, then they have to invent another way. And that way came through the second imperative, which is, what is the highest commodity? What is the greatest commodity that is sold throughout the world? It's oil. So they imposed, or actually had an agreement with those who have oil, or produce oil, is that this oil must be, not that they have access to it, because of course they do have access to it, all these are American companies, but that will only be sold in dollars. So the US maintains its hegemony by, one, making the dollar the currency of the world, and two, by making sure that oil and great commodities will only be sold in dollars. So the US in debt, it's a hugely in debt, 22 trillion, that's almost 150% of its GDP in terms of private debt, and almost 110% of its public debt, and now it's increasing with the coronavirus even. This is just an example of student loans. This is almost almost $1 trillion, just student loans alone. So the US today is about 62% of the US dollars are in the foreign exchange reserves. And so they built all these economic institutions to ensure that this is the case. It is very difficult for other institutions, and by doing that is by enticing countries to buy their treasury bonds. So we could see, you know, for instance, here is the trade deficit. This is how much the US exports. This is how much it imports. So this is the trade deficit. The trade deficit is almost $600 billion. Every single year, the US takes more from the world than it actually gives them by 600 billion. The US prints this money basically out of thin air, and it is the only country that can actually print money without consequence to its currency. The dollar doesn't fall down, actually it gets strengthened. The inflation is only under 1 or 2%, never goes in a wild turns, and no other country could do that. And that comes through this projection of military power and dominance and hegemonic presence and existence throughout the different institutions. Whenever the US has a problem, all what it can do is simply to print money and get out of that problem. And that's what it's been doing for years. And it has to maintain this, to maintain the empire, to maintain that power. If the US loses its ability to print dollars without consequences, or to have the dollar as the reserve country in the world, the US empire would simply end. Here is the debts. These are the countries who actually hold debts over the US. China owns about $1.2 trillion of US debt. Japan is about $1 trillion. Every single country has to buy into treasury in order to be part of that financial system that the US has constructed, has built. including small countries like Lebanon. Lebanon today has like 30 billion. This is a country in debt, but yet it owns about $30 billion of treasury bonds because it is the Lebanese currency, and of course all the Gulf countries and many other currencies around the world are tied to the US dollar. And because tied to the US dollar, they have to be part of that system. In terms of oil, this is the commodity that is sold the most in the world, hundreds of billions of dollars, and it has to be in dollars to maintain, again, when China pays dollars, when it buys oil from Saudi Arabia, it buys it in dollars. Where does it get the dollar from? From the printer of dollar. Therefore, the actual owner of the largest commodity, even more than oil in the world, would be the person or the country that actually prints the dollar. Here is the reserve. We're talking about 1.2 trillion barrels owned by OPEC, and about 280, mostly in Russia and other places. But here, when you talk about 1.2 trillion barrels, that's more than all the gold in the world. That's the real money. That's the real wealth that takes place, and that's basically then the U.S. strategic economic imperative is to make sure that these countries will be in the U.S. orbit, that this will be under they will be under the protection of the U.S., that they would be that these governments and these countries would be under the control of the U.S. Otherwise, this whole leverage, this whole system would collapse. Here's the total wealth around the globe. So that obviously is going to be reflected in terms of wealth. The U.S. owns about 30% of the global wealth, and I want to go very quickly. That means it has the largest number of millionaires, and of course there's a problem with. And again, I don't have time. I'm almost out of time here. I have to end. So this is where the U.S. has the people in the U.S. They own a very small minority. I'm not going to talk about the U.S. We're talking about the elite. We're talking about the rich people. We're here. We talk about, this is a decade ago, 0.1% own almost 22% of the country. 1% owns about 40% of the wealth in the country, and about 10% own about 75%. And the bottom, this is the bottom 90%. This is about 250 million or more, 270 million own less than 25. So this is part of the problem. So just to summarize and end here, what I tried to do today is simply to show the strategic imperatives of the U.S. as well as its economic imperatives that maintain its presence as the global hegemon. And of course, that is not necessarily going to stay always. I also did not discuss the vulnerabilities and the weak points within this structure that the U.S. has built through centuries. There is a lot going on in the U.S. This is only what we are seeing here is how we can look at this from the perspective of someone who is sitting in the Pentagon trying to maintain U.S. power and presence, but from a geopolitical point of view, and for us to understand how U.S. decision makers and policy makers are making their decisions. Thank you very much, and sorry for making it lengthier than I intended.
Thank you, Professor, for this interesting lecture. Really, there are lots of points worth to discuss, especially in this shifting era. Now is the time of Q&A, but before I open the floor for our viewers to ask their questions, I would like to understand well your own perspective, Professor, regarding to the current geopolitical debate among the American scholars and the schools about what is the best way or the best approach, geopolitical approach, of course, to solve the United States from its global crisis now. As you know, Professor, we can see like four main schools and the trends. now in this debate, engaging in this debate. The first one is the liberal hegemony advocates. I can mention here John Eikenberry, for example, Hal Brandt, Peter Fever, Joseph Nye, and others. The second one is the new realists, and we can mention here the advocates for more restrained strategy, like Stephen Walls and John Mearsheimer. Or inside this school, there are lots of ideas of Schwiller, for example, the end of the grand strategy, or Graham Allison, who mentioned the new spheres of influence as a new approach. And there are the third main school, I think, the new con, the return of new con. I can mention here the Andro Kronikovich, for example, who supports what he called the revolution in military and the militarization of foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy. And the fourth one is Trumpism now, the new isolationists, if we can say. Among this kind of four schools now, debating schools, my question is, if you are engaged, if you are a professor, an American professor engaged in this kind of geopolitical debates, in which side you are now, and what is, in your opinion, the best way to solve the United States from this trouble?
Wow, you're putting me in a hot seat. Well, I mean, it's true what you have described, the different schools of thought in terms of how to best use American power and to what ends. And certainly I understand all of them and where they're coming from. There is a problem, of course, with each one of them. And as people who live in third world countries, or people who live in different parts of the world where they could be at the receiving end of American hegemony, where they are being used for geopolitical situation, it's very difficult to see it that way. So it depends on what seat you're sitting in. If you were an American strategist sitting in Washington during the peak of the Cold War in the 60s and 70s, you would not think twice about what happens in certain countries around the world because of the proxy wars were taking place. All what you are concerned about is how to defeat and contain the Soviet Union. When the U.S. was supplying arms and financial assistance to different mujahideen, so-called mujahideens, people in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, they were concerned about defeating the Soviet Union. They were not really concerned much about the Afghani people. And once that the Soviet Union collapsed, they just took off and withdrew. So the whole idea was looking at from that point. So I would like to see more humane approach to these geopolitical problems. I want to see more and human dimension to it, rather than just simply strategic and hard calculations, where the human cost is usually not considered. But unfortunately, we don't see that much in many parts around the world, even when they try to employ some of these humanitarian assistance, like what happened in Bosnia, or what they tried to do in Somalia at the time, and they thought that they were going, and others. It's hollow. It's not really. It's not genuine concern. And we saw what happened in Iraq. For example, this promotion of democracy was a huge failure. It was never really about democracy. It's more about something else. And I believe it has to do, and this was like the last 2-3 slides that I didn't have time to go through, is that the U.S. today in the Middle East, part of its strategic calculation is they see Islamic countries as being an emerging threat, that the notion that somehow the Muslim countries can unite, some of these dream projects that a lot of people call for, whether it's a common market within Muslim countries, like Arbakan used to say, or whether trying to expand this notion of the Arab Spring, where you could have a series of democratic governments or a series of democratic presence throughout the Muslim world, or whether it's even lame cooperation, like what happened in Kuala Lumpur a few months ago with Pakistan and Turkey and Indonesia and Malaysia and so on and so forth. This is potentially could become a threatening presence for hegemony. And one of the strategists of the U.S. was calling that we need to do what the U.S. usually does, which is try to find out a fault line among or between its potential rivalries. And he said the biggest or the most important fault line that exists in the Muslim world today is the issue of sectarianism, the Shia Sunni, the Shia Sunni fault line, and therefore we need to exploit that and try to pit the Sunnis against the Shias. The question is whether the U.S. should ally itself with the Shias or the Sunnis. If that question was not settled during Obama, it is certainly settled during Trump, where this is the new strategy is to try to incite the sectarian divide within the Muslim world in order to keep that word basically weak. But getting back to your question about if I was living in the U.S., I would certainly advise those in power to bring the side of power that it can do what is good for the for humanity and for the human dimension, rather than sheer power. You know, at the end, my approach would be more of somebody who sees this whole world as united, you know, not as a series of rivalries. Of course, that's not the common view in the U.S. And we, you know, as Noam Chomsky says, we are having, not just because we realize that the pandemic, we have one world that everybody could be affected if something happens halfway across the world, but we're talking about the presence of nuclear weapons, which is a huge menace and threat to the future of humanity, as well as ecological problems, global warming and others. But many of the people in power really have very little, if any, concern to these challenges.
Thank you, Professor. Maybe for our audience, the last book of Joseph Nye, Do Morals Matter? Maybe it's useful in this kind of approach, humanitarian approach. So now the questions, I have many questions, and please feel free to ask questions, and it's better to get like direct and relevant questions. Here, I will take the first one one by one. Someone asked here, how do you assist Chinese reach in the Muslim world, you know, in this kind of shifting era? So he means the impact of the rise of China on Muslim world. And can you, Professor, foresee Muslim power to take advantage of this emerging multipolarity?
Well, first of all, this is obviously a convoluted question. I'll try to deconstruct it. First, when it comes to China, I really do not see China as a military rival to the US, not in the foreseen future. Yes, they are an economic giant, but they are very modest power when it comes to hard power. And I don't think the Chinese are trying, maybe in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, they will try to build their own navies. And of course, it's going to take time to do that. And but the China, first of all, does not have the history of being an occupying power in the same way that the colonizing powers took place from Europe. But at the same time, it does want to become at least a regional hegemon before it can extend its power. What China is doing is through its economic means trying to get a lot of or hold a lot of power. So we could see that they go to third world countries. They don't give them assistance like what the US is trying to do to leverage their power. They try to give them money in exchange for getting real assets. And I think that's going to be very dangerous, because pretty soon these countries will not be able to pay the debts to China. And then China, if they start claiming these assets, that's going to increase the tension that takes place between these countries and China. And that could be actually a justification for the interference of the US, because the US doesn't want these people to fall into China. The new Silk Road, you know, the China is trying to do, the initiative, the Belt Initiative, and so on and so forth. This is going to cost trillions of dollars, and it's going to endear many countries to China, you know, especially those in which this money is being invested. And that would be one way to get around the naval superiority that the US has, where China is going to try to have itself roads between China and Europe. But again, it's sea. We talk about transport cost. It's 10 times less cheap to go the seas rather than roads. But and nevertheless, this is going to obviously endear many countries to China. So, in short, I don't see China as being a global hegemon in any way, shape, or form in the foreseeable future. I see China as being a serious rival to many places, but not at the military means. Culture is another example. I mean, English has become the language of the internet, the language of the world, and that's dominated through culture by Americans, Hollywood, and so on and so forth. And China, how many people speak Chinese? I mean, China cannot take that role. That needs a lot of, takes centuries to develop, assuming that it could even be done. In terms of the Muslim countries, if you go back to the idea of Erbakan had a simple idea. He wanted to bring 8 most populous states within the Muslim world and try to have some kind of a common market, like the same way as the European market, and start from there at the grassroots with economic incentives and economic cooperation, rather than at the political or strategic military level. And it was very unfortunate. It was a very modest success. That exists on paper only. There's very few trade treaties between these countries. And for an emerging Muslim power, that needs, first of all, a determined vision, a good vision, a determined leadership, and some resources. And there will be a lot of conflicts in between, because a lot of the existing political orders would be against this, because it's going to take away from the interests. And especially, I mean, we could see very clearly in the aftermath of the Arab Spring how many of the regional governments that they were in principle against this idea of people taking the matters into their own hands and establishing democratic orders. So they immediately turned against them, and they were able to bring down several experiments, through civil wars, through coups, through other places, in order to end these experiments. Now, these countries, for the most part, are being supported, unfortunately, by the U.S. Just to give you an example, when the coup took place in Egypt, and some of the senators were pretty upset about this, they brought in the chief of staff of the U.S. Army, in which the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that's everybody, and they asked him, why can't we suspend military aid to Egypt, for example? And his answer was, we give Egypt about $1.3 billion a year. But the amount of return that we get simply just by crossing the Suez Canal, we save, and I'm quoting, $5 billion. He said, and we take priority. U.S. Navy, if there is a ship that's going through the Suez, all other shipping stops. The agreement is that the U.S. shipping is go, and this takes a huge advantage over all other rivals. If the U.S. ship is needed somewhere else, they can rush through the Suez Canal. All other shipping will stop in order to allow U.S. shipping to go forward, and talk about military ships here, including nuclear ones. So this is a huge strategic asset, and the U.S. may not get that kind of advantage if there were nationalistic, or they will be more an independent-minded rulers in these type of words. They want places where they can get these kind of agreements through, and that doesn't happen with popular or democratic governments.
Thank you, Professor. I think you answered to Dr. Junaid Ahmed question in the same context. So that's why let me jump to another question. And someone asked about will you be able to briefly explain, please, a few strategic objectives in the Middle East, particularly points 1, 6, and 7, please?
Well,
I think to talk about that. Yeah.
All right, and that means I have to share
strategies.
Yeah, yes. Let me share them. 1 second. All right. So when we talk about U.S. Military objectives, can you see it? I'm not sure if you can see it. This is my reading of the U.S. strategic objectives in the Middle East. One of the importance of existence of these different military alliances and military presence is obviously to protect Israel. And I'm going to give another lecture in about a couple of weeks about Israel, the geopolitics of Israel. So I will defer to that lecture. But also the controlling of the oil, as I said, and the current maintaining of the currency and the stability of the region, because that plays a huge role into U.S. Economic order. The military bases throughout, and I show that in the case of Iran as an example, the importance of the Suez Canal, the sea lanes, the overflight rights that take place, because the U.S. is in a corner of the world that is not very accessible, and therefore they need access. That's why you have 800 and hundreds of military bases, and they need to be able to go to any part of the world in order to maintain that control and hegemony and presence. Also, the weapons sales and markets. We saw that the example for Trump when he went to and visited Saudi Arabia, for example, the trades and the investments and so on. Also, to prevent any attempt towards unity and independence power, and that has to do with the fifth strategic imperative when we talked about the U.S. trying to not have any emerging power that could threaten its hegemonic status, its supremacy. And that comes also, this came basically after 9/11, the fight in political Islam and any ideologies to U.S. control. Because before that, many of these political Islamic groups, they served the U.S. interest when they were concerned with the Soviet Union and communism, and they were used to that effect. But when they started turning their activities against U.S. Control and hegemony, and especially with the emergence of the Iranian Revolution and its strong stand against U.S. presence in the area, then obviously that became a strategic objective as well, that they do not want any kind of an ideology that they cannot control, or at least could start giving problems for the U.S. And lastly, and this is very much seated, the cultural hegemony and political influence. And I said part of power, military, economic, technology, as Brzezinski defines them. He says power has four aspects. He says, I'm talking about Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former national security advisor and the strategic thinker and author. He said power has four aspects: military, economy, technology, and culture. And then he makes this comment. He says the Muslim world cannot actually compete against the West in the first three, but they can compete on culture. And he meant, of course, Islamic culture. But here we see, even in the coronavirus pandemic situation, where all Hollywood movies and TV stations, now they have been deciphered and they are open to the whole world that they can watch, because everybody is spending now their time at home, and they're given basically free of charge to maintain this cultural hegemony. People know about the U.S., about its system, about the different problems they have, about the singers, the plays, the authors, the sports, and so on and so forth. That's a huge leverage. That's soft power, but that's very important, because when you control the mind and how they think, you certainly have gone a long way into controlling the people.
Thanks, Professor. I have here two questions regarding Trump policy. First one, Mr. Khalid asked, and he said, I know you warned against the election of Trump. However, as far as Muslims are concerned, is there any difference to the Muslim Ummah which party holds power, knowing they both consider Islam as an enemy? And the second one, the same, I think. How does currently Trump balance out anti-Muslim commentary at home with maintaining diplomatic ties with strong Muslim allies abroad? Does it ever backfire?
Well, I want to say, first of all, that Islam is not necessarily the enemy of the U.S. Islam could be also it depends what Islam are we talking about. There are some Muslim countries who are great vessels. They are great friends of the U.S. because they facilitate U.S. interest in this hegemonic view. So we have to be very careful how we use the language and the words. The U.S. supported the Afghan Mujahids, but this is not about Islam. It's not about religion at all. What it is about, it's against the Soviet Union. So it was the Islamic jihad at the time, the jihad that the people were engaged in, was greatly supported by the U.S. because it furthered U.S. interests. So the U.S. would be against any attempt, whether Islamic or non-Islamic, that is going to threaten its position and hegemony in the world. And some of these are illegitimate, some of them are legitimate, and the contention with people is with the illegitimate ones. So I want to just dispose of this situation. About elections, certainly the elections this fall is going to be very crucial, because we're talking about it depends whether when we talk about American Muslims, from the agenda of American Muslims, those who live in the United States, Donald Trump is horrible. His policies are going to affect Americans in general and Muslims in particular for many decades to come, especially with the appointments of judges and on the Supreme Court and others. So from that standpoint only, the presence of Muslims in the U.S. is going to be greatly affected, especially in the second term where he is totally unrestrained. From the outside the country, also depends on, when we talk about Joe Biden, then we're talking about more of the Obama type of policies. So it depends which part of the world you're living in. But also there are places where you have windows of change. And I think the windows of change during Trump is going to be more difficult than the windows of change during a Democratic administration. Finally, when it comes to, because a lot of people ask me about elections, in the US, because this is one of the vulnerabilities that I didn't have time to go through, but one of the vulnerabilities is its political system. It's an archaic system. So even though you have 50 states, the actual election actually takes place in 7 or 8 states. The candidates even never visit 42, 43 states during this whole campaign. The whole thing would be maintained by about 6 or 7 states, 7, 8 states, talking about Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, Florida, possibly Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, and maybe Minnesota. I don't know. It depends on who's going to be the vice president. So you have about 7 or 8 states where the whole election would be decided on this. That means we start from a base of somebody needs to get another perhaps 40 or 50 electoral states. That means they need to win 3 or 4 states, depending on how big they are. And then you win the presidency. So certainly it's open. And I can see a lot of surprises taking place, and that means that it could go either way, even though Trump would certainly lose the popular vote. I mean, he could lose it by millions. He could lose by 10 million votes, and yet he becomes the president of the United States because of the nature of the system they have. He could lose California by 20 million people, but he's losing it anyway, so it doesn't matter. But he could win Florida by 100 votes, and that will make him president.
Thank you, Professor. Maybe I should conclude the last question.
You can go a few more minutes because we started a bit late.
Okay. So you mentioned now that the Trump policy harms the Muslim world in general, and especially the Palestinian cases. But some scholars in the United States, like Stephen Walls and other realists, predict that maybe if John Biden return again and win the next election, it's likely to the U.S. foreign policy come back to the liberal hegemony approach, which failed in his perspective, and which we see the impacts of this kind of liberal hegemony in Iraq since the end of the Cold War, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and others. So, do you think if we balance between Trump and Biden, we don't have any other choices in light of the miss of our strategy? If you haven't strategy, you will be a part of another strategy, as you know. So if you balance between the two characteristics of of this approach, which will be
Well,
better for the Muslim world?
again, it's similar to the question that was asked earlier. When we talk about the policy the U.S. pursues, I mean, I said there are strategic imperatives that the U.S. is going to pursue no matter who is in the White House. But of course, they would have different tactics. So in terms of its what they call strategic interests, and I gave you the 6 strategic imperatives that guide these strategic interests, they're not going to be much difference. What Trump did when it came to his withdrawal from Syria, which affected one of these strategic interests because it loosened the situation between Turkey and the Kurds, it gave the upper hand to the Turkish situation, even though they're not totally defeated. I'm talking about the Kurdish army. But it does make a difference when it comes to American strategic planners, because they have been working on this building up of the Kurdish situation for years, and for Trump to come and withdraw like this, it affected them to the point that even the Secretary of Defense had to resign because he thought that this is totally outrageous. But I think what Trump was doing, he had his own calculations that had to do with probably other orders in the Middle East and his financial interest because of the relationship with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and others. You know, this is different discussion altogether. But at the end of the day, as I said, for change to take place in this part of the world, in this region, you need some windows of opportunities and a calculated factors to take place all simultaneously. These kind of things will have more possibilities to take shape and place, I believe, in a democratic and liberal order and presidency than in a Trump presidency. You know, Trump is going to give carte blanche basically to any regime here to have whatever crackdown they have. He will never talk about human rights, civil rights. He will never pressure governments to do any kind of democratic or reforms, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on the people to make or to rise up for any meaningful change. But in a democratic situation, or a democratic administration, I should say, you may have these possibilities, and in which, with a combination of other factors, you may get the breaking point. You may get that window of opportunities in which a change could actually take place. We saw that very clearly during the 2011 uprisings throughout the region, where Obama stood on the lawn of the White House on February the 10th, and he told Mubarak, it's time to go. The next day he resigned. Trump will never do that.
Okay, let's take the final question. Will you think that American Muslims able to have political sway as much as the IPAC, for example, talking about the lobbying in the United States? Maybe this is one of the ways of affect and make some change inside the US establishments.
Very good question, actually, and it cannot be answered in a few minutes. The short answer is yes, it's possible. I mean, we did back in the late 90s, early 2000. The Muslim vote was mobilized around the issue of secret evidence. I was there in the middle of it, and despite the opposition of many groups, you know, especially AIPAC and others. AIPAC not necessarily, they didn't take really a direct thing, but there were other groups tightly allied to the AIPAC that were vehemently against it, and yet we won. We won in the Congress. We won at the time in the House of Representatives of the Judiciary Committee, 26-2. I had 129 Congress people signing, co-sponsoring the legislation. It almost passed, or got to the point where it could pass the Senate, but we ran out of time. And then the Muslim vote made a difference in the 2000 elections, not because they favored Bush's policies on Iraq or Palestine or others. It was a very simple calculation at the time that the Muslim community reasoned that they cannot win on any other policy issues before winning their civil rights battle, and that because Bush came very strongly in favor of the banning or end of secret evidence, that particular problem was defined as being the civil rights battle of the time of the Muslim community, American Muslim community. And they thought, if we win this battle, then that will put us into a different situation where we can actually have a seat at the table and start influencing other policy initiatives. And of course, that failed after that because of 9/11. But even on the day of 9/11, Bush was supposed to meet with the leaders of the Muslim community, American Muslim community, at the White House to announce the end of the use of secret evidence. Would have been the greatest victory of American Muslims, but but it didn't happen because obviously of 9/11. So the short answer is yes, but to do that you need a bold vision and a real vision. You need determined leadership, you need the willpower, and you need resources to embark on this. It's going to be very thorny, but it's doable.
Thank you, Professor. In the end of this lecture, I would like to thank you on behalf of CIGA, on behalf of our audience, for this interesting lecture. And let me remind you, tomorrow we're gonna have another lecture presented by Dr. Arab Aslan Achiggenj, professor at Ibn Khaldun University, entitled "The Epistemological and Sociological Function of Philosophy." See you tomorrow, and Salamun alaikum.
Thank you.